The money was real, the offices were real, the confidence, most of all, that was real. In the months before April 2020, Quibi had raised nearly $1.75 billion from some of the most sophisticated media investors on the planet. Jeffrey Katzenberg, a man who had spent decades reshaping Hollywood, was its chairman and public face. Meg Whitman, who had built eBay into a global marketplace and run a credible campaign for governor of California, was its CEO. These were not dreamers. These were operators, people who had stared down failure before and won. The pitch decks were pristine, the talent deals were signed, Steven Spielberg had a show, Chrissy Teigen had a show, the platform had a name that felt futuristic and clean, Quibi, short for quick bites. Content for the commute, the lunch break, the elevator ride, mobile first, premium, and built for the way people actually lived. Then the launch came, and 6 months later, it was over. Not slowly, not gracefully, over. The idea behind Quibi was, in its bones, a reasonable one. By the late 2010s, the streaming wars had crowded the living room. Netflix, HBO, Hulu, Amazon, the battle for the television screen was brutal and expensive. But the phone screen, that was different. People spent hours each day on their smartphones, consuming content in fragments, 2 minutes here, 8 minutes there. YouTube had proven the appetite. Instagram had proven the attention span. What nobody had yet built, Katzenberg argued, was premium, cinematic content engineered specifically for that format. Each episode would run between 4 and 10 minutes. The production values would rival anything on HBO. The technology would be genuinely innovative. Quibi's so-called turnstile feature allowed the image to reformat seamlessly as the viewer rotated their phone from portrait to landscape. Whole shows were shot twice, from 2 different angles, to make this work. It was not a hack or a workaround. It was a genuine technical achievement. The platform launched in April 2020 with 90 days of free trial subscriptions and a library of original content that would expand daily. The plan was to reach 7 million subscribers in its first year. By some early measures, the launch generated genuine attention. Millions downloaded the app in the first days. The people who worked there believed in it. The investors who backed it believed in it. The journalists who covered the entertainment industry wrote, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that Quibi represented a serious bet on a real behavioral shift. Katzenberg had read the research. The research said people watched video on their phones. The research said they wanted it shorter. The research said they'd pay for quality. The research was not wrong. The timing was. In March 2020, 3 weeks before Quibi launched, governments across the United States and Europe began issuing stay-at-home orders in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The commute disappeared. The lunch break at a cafe disappeared. The elevator ride, the airport terminal, the idle 10 minutes between meetings, all of it disappeared. The exact behavioral context that Quibi had spent years and nearly $2 billion engineering for simply ceased to exist. People were home all day, every day, watching content on their televisions. There is a temptation, in retrospect, to treat this as obvious, as a failure so foreseeable that only fools could have missed it. But that framing is unfair, and more importantly, it's inaccurate. In January 2020, when Quibi's launch infrastructure was largely locked in, COVID-19 was a regional outbreak in Wuhan that most Western epidemiologists were still monitoring from a careful distance. By mid-February, markets had not yet collapsed. The commute was still happening. The world that Quibi had been built for still existed. The decision to proceed with the April launch, and to do so without material modification to the product's core premise, was made in the context of genuine uncertainty. Katzenberg and Whitman had a platform that was finished, a library that was ready, and a contractual infrastructure that was not easily unwound. They had 1,500 employees and investors expecting a return. Delaying felt like retreat. Pivoting felt like admitting the product was wrong before anyone had even tried it. In the internal discussions of that period, described later by people who were present, the argument for proceeding was framed around resilience. The pandemic would be temporary, and the platform would be there when life returned to normal. Quibi would be waiting for the commute when the commute came back. What they underestimated was not the pandemic's duration. It was the competitive damage that 6 months of absence would do in a market that was accelerating. While people were trapped at home, Netflix added 30 million new subscribers. TikTok exploded. YouTube's watch time grew. The attention landscape was being reshaped in real time, and Quibi's window was quietly closing. The subscriber numbers began telling the story before management was prepared to tell it publicly. By May 2020, just weeks after launch, internal data suggested that a significant share of free trial users were not converting to paid subscriptions. The 90-day free trial had been designed as an acquisition funnel. Instead, it was functioning as a free content distribution mechanism for people who had no intention of paying $4.99 or $7.99 a month for a platform they could not use on their television. That last point became a rallying complaint almost immediately. Users wanted to cast Quibi content from their phones to their TV screens. The platform did not support this at launch, a deliberate product decision rooted in the mobile-first philosophy. Katzenberg initially dismissed the criticism, suggesting in interviews that the product was working as intended. The response amplified rather than quieted the dissatisfaction. By summer 2020, the download numbers had declined sharply from their launch peak. The platform had generated significant press coverage, but almost none of it was about the content. It was about the dysfunction, the mismatch, the timing. Trade publications that had covered Quibi's fundraising with admiration were now running pieces with headlines that carried an unmistakable undertone of reckoning. Internally, the mood had shifted. People who joined Quibi because they believed in the mission were now watching that mission contract in real time. Content creators who had built shows specifically for the format found themselves on a platform that users were abandoning. The turnover among senior staff accelerated. Executives who had joined from established studios and networks began quietly sounding out opportunities elsewhere. The board, which included representatives from major media companies and investment firms, pressed for answers. The answers were not encouraging. Quibi had spent aggressively on content, over $1 billion committed, and had relatively little subscriber revenue to show for it. The path to profitability, which had always depended on reaching scale quickly, was not materializing. In August 2020, roughly 4 months after launch, Quibi began exploring options: additional fundraising, a potential sale, a restructuring. The conversations did not produce results. The potential acquirers who kicked the tires, and there were reportedly several, concluded that the content library, while expensive to produce, had limited value outside the platform's proprietary format. What Quibi owned was not easily transferable. By October, the exploration was over. The company announced it would shut down. On October 21, 2020, Katzenberg and Whitman sent a letter to investors acknowledging that Quibi had failed. The platform would cease operations. The content library would be sold. The employees, roughly 200 remained at that point, following earlier reductions, would receive severance packages. The letter was, by all accounts, candid. It acknowledged that the timing of the launch, coinciding with the pandemic, was a critical factor. It did not minimize the role of the product's own shortcomings. It was not the letter of people who believed they had done nothing wrong. The content library was eventually sold to Roku, which made the shows available for free on its platform. The turnstile technology found no immediate buyers. The brand name became a footnote, cited in business school cases and podcast episodes about spectacular failures. The offices were vacated. The equipment was sold. The people who had worked there dispersed to Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and the dozens of other companies competing for the same sliver of talent. The human cost was real but largely invisible. The people who had moved cities, turned down other offers, and built their professional identities around Quibi's success had to absorb not just a job loss, but a particular kind of public failure, the kind that gets covered. The kind that carries a name people recognize. Investors wrote off their losses. For some, the amounts were large. For others, it was one bad bet in a diversified portfolio. For Katzenberg personally, who had invested his own capital alongside institutional money, the financial and reputational consequences were significant and lasting. The standard narrative of Quibi's failure settles on the pandemic as the explanation, and the pandemic was real. The timing was genuinely catastrophic, but the pandemic explains why Quibi struggled in April 2020. It does not fully explain why Quibi could not adapt in the months that followed. What Quibi's story actually reveals is something more structural: the danger of building a company around a single behavioral assumption that cannot be tested until the moment of launch. The mobile-first thesis was coherent and evidence-based, but it was evidence gathered from a world in which people moved. It had never been stress-tested against a world in which they did not. And because the entire product architecture, the entire content strategy, and the entire financial model were built around that one thesis, there was no fallback position. More critically, the platform's leadership had constructed a vision so complete, so internally consistent, and so expensively committed to that the psychological cost of questioning it had become prohibitive. This is not unique to Quibi. It is a trap that every ambitious organization faces: the moment when the conviction that made you successful begins to function as a filter against disconfirming information. By early 2020, the concerns being raised about television casting, about the pandemic's potential impact, about conversion rates were heard, but they were processed inside a system optimized for belief, not revision. The lesson is not that Quibi should have pivoted faster or hired differently or raised a different amount of capital. The lesson is that the very qualities that make organizations capable of raising $1.75 billion and attracting world-class talent, certainty, coherence, narrative momentum, are the same qualities that make it nearly impossible to hear the signal inside the noise when the world changes. Every company that has recently succeeded contains some version of this, a core belief that explains the past so well it has become invisible as an assumption. The question is not whether the belief is true today. The question is whether the organization has the capacity to find out when it stops being true, and whether it can do so before the cost of finding out becomes the cost of the whole company. Today, Quibi does not exist. The brand was acquired. The shows still live on Roku, watched mostly by people who do not know or have forgotten where they came from. The turnstile technology, the real technical achievement of the whole enterprise, never found a second home. What remains is a useful ghost, a reminder that in the history of failure, the most instructive cases are rarely the ones where someone was foolish. They are the ones where someone was smart and certain and very slightly wrong. The commute did come back. Quibi just wasn't there to see it.